All right, thank you very much. Today I'm going to tell you the story about how I convinced over 2,000 people to paint with fish. So first, just a little bit about myself. I have a lot of training in science, so I think in a systematic way. And by the way, I think I wrote that I appear to be a hot mess of disorganization, not that I am a hot mess of disorganization. Okay, so you can tell I'm a scientist not just because of the glasses, but because I've had training and I have multiple degrees in things like biochemistry and chemical ecology and animal science and neurobiology and behavior. And I received this job a few years ago, and it wasn't actually because of those degrees. It was because of the fact that I had run a museum of natural history, or not a museum of natural history, a museum of vertebrate collections at Penn State University. And so I know now probably that many of you are thinking about this kind of a museum that's big and bright and has many animals in it. People come to see it, and that it is someplace that is full of exhibits that you want to touch and maybe interact with. But then remember, I was a scientist, and I still am a scientist, and I ran a museum for scientists. So my museum actually looked like this. And it was much utilized by, well, almost no one actually. And very few people actually wanted to come back again once they had seen this particular museum. Usually they came for a specific research purpose. They wanted a bone, they wanted to look at that bone, they got the bone, and then they never came back again. But in my new job here in southern Utah, I was running a museum that we wanted people to come to. And we wanted people to return to this museum. It was part of my job to make sure that they wanted to come back again. So I needed to design a museum that was much different than the museum I had worked in at Penn State. And I knew that people were going to be coming to my museum here in Utah because I had teamed up with these great people, Deb Snyder, who's an arts education person, and Delaney Patterson, a student of arts education. And these great people were really wonderful, but really different from me and my scientific background. So we got together and we knew, like I said, people to our museum because we had planned a fall program in which we expected over 1,000 people to show up for. And what the goal of our program was to integrate science and art together. So we had come across this idea that we were going to have them go to the Braithwaite Gallery and learn about art, and then come to the museum and integrate art with science. And being that I was recently from Pennsylvania, I was pretty excited to teach people about endangered species, not only because I didn't know any of the endangered species in Pennsylvania, and I knew some of them here in Utah, but I also had training as a conservation biologist. Now, I should warn you, the next slide may be disturbing to some people, so if there are small children in the room, you might want to shield them. This is a Utah prairie dog. Now, if you're not from Utah, you don't know why this is disturbing. But for our community here in Cedar City, this prairie dog symbolizes, for some people, all that is wrong with the federal government and federal control. And so, when I started consulting with my colleagues about a whole entire educational program for the children of this community based on the Utah prairie dog, it didn't go over very well. And as I wanted to keep this newly given job that I had, I thought maybe I should change my plans. So we began, well, actually I began consulting with other colleagues. I was new, so I was a new colleague who was a fish biologist. And I thought to myself, really? We have a fish biologist on staff, a person who specializes in the study of fish. This is Utah. Now, much of our scenery in Utah is absolutely fantastic, but no one looks at this scenery and says, that's a place to go study fish. After thinking about it, I realized that we do have good water in Utah, and we do have bucket loads of endangered species and sensitive species of fish. So I consulted with my colleagues in arts ed, and we thought about how could we bring fish and endangered species together in an educational program. And what we came up with was something called gyotaku. Gyotaku is fish printing. It's a Japanese word that means print with fish. And what you do, on the bottom you can see there is a dead fish. So you paint this fish, You put paper over the top of the fish, and then pull the paper off, and you have a fish print, hence fish printing. So with your fish print, you then can learn something about the biology of that fish. Maybe how it swims, what kind of habitat it lives in, maybe even what it eats, depending on how it's shaped. So you might have realized I have a problem, because if I want to make a fish print, I need to kill my fish. And unfortunately, you can't kill endangered species, even for educational purposes. So we had a problem. We had to think of a new solution. And what we came up with, we did a little bit of searching online. It turns out for arts education that rubber fish specifically for Gyotaku are commercially available. And they're kind of something like this. So you can buy these fish online from many different sources, and you paint the fish. They're made specifically for classroom education projects. Now, the only problem is fish that are commercially available are fish usually that we want to eat. Not that we want to eat the rubber fish, but species that we like to eat, because those are what are familiar with us. But in Utah, our native and endangered species usually are not the kind of fish that we want to eat. So we had yet another problem we needed to overcome before we could move forward. And what we came upon, and some people might have a preconceived notion that scientists in general are boring and not creative people. But what you should know, well, let's see. If you're a scientist, if you're playing a party, that you will very rarely say, let's have a whole bunch of scientists over, because that's going to rock the party. Sorry, I had to get the joke in there. Okay, but scientists are actually really creative people because we spend our whole careers solving problems. That's just what we do. So we worked together and we came up with this solution. We would sculpt our own fish. So we sculpted our own fish, and you can see this fish here. And what you'll notice is that it's very rigid. It doesn't flop at all. And you might think, well, they had their solution. They could now print with these fish. Well, these fish were not very flexible, and they're kind of hard and rigid. And so you can imagine that if you hit someone with a fish like this, it wouldn't go over well. And what we had in our classroom, a whole bunch of 7-year-olds, a whole bunch of 8-year-olds. If you've ever been in a classroom full of 8-year-olds, you know someone's going to get hit. So we had to come up with another solution. We took our sculptures and found polymers and used, we have an assortment of polymers we could choose from, soft ones or hard ones, and we used those to create a mold of fish, but we still couldn't print with our fish yet. So what we had to do then was take our polymers and create our actual rubber fish. And you can see these are nice and flexible. No one's going to get hurt if they get hit with one of those. So we were able to create this really nice collection of fish that are native to Utah or endangered species that we find in the state, and create these beautiful fish prints with them. And we ended up having not 1,000 people come to the museum that year, but over 2,000 come. And we were able to teach them about the biology of fish. So for example, in this fish here, you can see that it's long, it has a fork-shaped tail. That means it's really good at swimming fast. So we were easily able to teach people about an endangered species and some of its habits. This is another native species that's not endangered, but what you can see here is that this fish's fins are much different than the previous fish. This fish, because of its shape, its big blunt head, its huge fins relative to its body size, is really good at hiding down in crevices and cracks at the bottom of streams. So we were able to teach many, many people about an endangered species almost without them even knowing it. No one got super upset about the fact that we were teaching children in the area about endangered species, and we created these really beautiful art projects. So what I would like to leave you with is, if you find yourself in an intractable situation which seems to be riddled with recurring problems, what I suggest is that you surround yourself with people who are different from you and think differently from you, and think about how you might solve your problem by painting with fish. Thank you very much.